Sahaviryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditamastu ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us, may he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace.
Well, good evening, everyone. Happy day. Happy evening.
Oh, it's you.
Yes. So, Swami, where are we tonight?
We're still with Swami Abhedananda. I think this is volume 7, in case you're following along. And the title of the chapter is Way to the Blessed Life. We are on page 138.
Why don't you start us
All
out
right.
and see where we head to?
The unblessedness consists in the idea of separateness of the part from the whole, and in the bondage of other imperfections arising from this mistaken notion of individual isolation. To be united with the whole, to be free from the bondage of these imperfections, and to be perfect, are blessedness. Each individual germ of life, which we have already called the apparent life, possesses an innate tendency towards the attainment of this blessedness, and also freedom from the condition of unblessedness. Our earthly life consists in a continuous fight with the environments which have kept us away from the central truth or the blessed life. We are constantly struggling to expand the sphere of self-love by breaking down the walls of limitations which constrain the apparent life to a narrow selfishness, and thus to be united with the true life of perfection. This is one of these infinite paragraphs. Shall I continue?
Oh, I think I'd like to chime in here because he's mentioned evolution. Yeah, this goes on at least for the whole next page.
Yeah.
Almost, it's virtually 2 pages, one paragraph. The evolutionists do not know the cause of the variation or of natural selection. Well, that's an interesting statement for him to make in the year that he made it, because as a matter of fact, I think it could be fairly adjoined, the conversation, that Darwin himself in 1920, or when he introduced the book, before the Civil War, really had an idea of the variation. I think he thought that it was just a random variation of a bunch of piglets, that all 6 of them will be slightly different. But since then, and my roommate and I had a big discussion about that once, and he was right, I was wrong. That's Sid again, Sid Lamb. He said the latest findings were that basically the variations in the little piglets or in the DNA has to do with things like cosmic rays, you see, and bebopping along. So they cannot say what determines life. That's a very interesting question, and makes it manifest differently at every step of evolution. Well, here comes some big phrases again. This is one of the unsatisfactorily examined or dealt with predicaments. There was something called vital force, they thought, in water, for example, because mosquitoes would come out of it, spontaneous creation like that. So that kind of had its day and didn't last too long. But then the question is, as it is seen, that molecular chains do have some kind of relative predominance in the elbowing of molecules, and bigger chains, things happen. other atoms are attracted to bigger molecules, and there's actually probably something that looks like movement in the pre-living condition of these things going on. But I guess it looks as if life arose once and only once on the face of the earth. That, from an evolutionary or scientific point of view, is kind of like amazing. Now, whether, to simplify it, a one-celled creature popped up one day in a warm tidal pool or not is an interesting point. But very fundamental is, did life begin only at one point in time, more or less? And if so, why? If so, pacto. Because now it seems that life well may have occurred first at places that now we would call the mid-Atlantic rift. The continents have bebopped around, bumped into each other, formed big continents, supercontinents, several times since the birth of the Earth. But it looks like the sulfur-rich coming up from the magma as the plates at the center of the Atlantic go like this, well up from beneath in realms that sunlight never penetrates. It looks like these creatures, which look like plants but are actually animals, very intriguing stuff, may be closer to the bedrock and the origin of the place of life. So I have to think that the mind will imagine that on that day, be a great day, what a day, whenever life did start from so-called inanimate, which is really not right, unliving molecules, that maybe a whole bunch of these little critters occurred at one time. For simplification, we can imagine one cell coming. So those things are definitely intriguing. And why only one? Spontaneous creation, they used to call it when they'd see mosquitoes coming out of the water. But Vedanta philosophy says that the cause of this variation, circa 1920, is that innate tendency in a germ of life to be united to the whole and to reach perfection. Well, let this sentence stand. The aim of each apparent life or ego is to reach that state of blessedness which is the goal of evolution. These are pretty fundamental concepts. It looks like some kind of mold, pretty elemental life form, a colony, a family, is able to detect the presence of another family of the same mold, and if you wish to use the word ego to try to describe this concept, as a defensive mechanism, tries to reject the presence of the separate colony in its location. Interesting stuff. So, this is the Swami rolling along. Let's see what else he's going to do for a while. As we approach nearer and nearer to perfection, by passing through the various stages of physical, mental, and intellectual evolution, the ways of our living become better. And by experience we learn that the best way of true living is not by obeying the dictates of the apparent life, or lower self, the one in relativity, in Maya, but by following the blessed will of the universal being, which is reality, the other is appearance, which is the true and absolute life. Swami, why don't you?
Yeah, of course, John Dobson used to talk about how the ego was a genetic organism for the survival of the organism, which he's kind of referring to here.
Yes, yes.
So we're all kind of um, stuck with this problem of the ego. How do you solve the problem of the ego?
Oh, well, no, no.
So, and that's what spiritual practices are all about. That's why Swami Vivekananda emphasized unselfishness. Uh, that's why you study the scriptures. That's why you develop devotional practices. All of these things. That's why you try to quiet the mind so that you're not thinking separate. You're thinking. Your thoughts become more united with the whole. So all of these spiritual practices are designed for that. It's interesting the fact that all the DNA is similar in all the living organisms certainly points to some sort of single origin.
It
and,
does.
And I listened to a whole course on trying to figure out how life could have started. And the number of obstacles is just overwhelming. You know, everybody got excited when they created a few protein fragments, a few amino acids in a petri dish with lightning and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But that's hardly gets you even close. DNA is a complicated molecule. You've got to follow. How do you form? Where do you get all those ingredients? You've got the bases and the ribose chain and so forth, and then you've got to form some sort of membrane around the DNA. So you've got all of these different components, none of which look like they're very easy to get together at one time. It's truly an amazing problem.
Well, it really is an amazing problem. It seems to me that we're on to something here that's worth noodling a little bit, and that is that in the process of evolution into a living entity form, we have the components of the enzymes in outer space. We have conjunctions of molecules which are, I believe, it would be appropriate to say like proteins. In other words, there are almost ready to go organic molecules out there floating around near the earth. So it looked like the time was beginning to be ripe, that's for sure. And John was right with the whole story. And well, that's enough for now. Now let's just see what we're going to do.
Okay.
You want to start? We started first.
We start. I'll start with we start. We started first with a little weak and dim ray of will, which gradually becomes wider and stronger and brighter as we ascend through the different grades of evolution. Experience teaches us the relation that exists between the individual will and the cosmic will, the will that governs the universe. How about a comma there? Would that work? Should we add a comma for proofreading between the will and the will, cosmic will, comma the will?
I guess so. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. When we realize the true relation of the individual will to the universal will, we find that life or will, which we have so long called ours, is not ours, but is simply a part and parcel of that one and universal life or will which moves the universe.
Excuse me, dear brother. That word that phrase I was looking for is amino acids.
Mm-hmm.
Now what are they doing out there? It just a couple hundred miles out there or whatever around the Earth. But nevertheless, the whole thing is some kind of grand conjunction, grand union, which is much more the nature of an organic reality based on energy than it is a mechanical misunderstanding based on objective things, machine parts. So, anyway, please continue. This is fascinating.
Our bodies are like so many little instruments through which the universal life principle is expressing itself on the plane of phenomena. The mind, will, and life of one individual are not entirely separate from those of another, but are connected with all mind, all which is one and indivisible. As long as we do not realize this, but on the contrary, think of ourselves as separate from one another and as not related to the universe, so long shall we follow the dictates of our limited and imperfect will and think that we are doing so, we shall gain the highest benefit.
Well, you see, this is what Swamiji is talking about. Everything can be retranslated. This is a penchant that I happen to find, so I say delightful, into positive terms. And it's really very helpful for a lot of us to think of Swamiji's terms in positive terms. He says we should be unselfish. Well, you know, most Americans seeking the mighty dollar, that's a painful word. It's a cold, hard, wintry word. Why should I, a businessman trying to accrue enough money, hopefully for economic independence for my family, which is a legitimate aim, why should I be unselfish? Why should I want to be? First, I got to feed my family first. And all of a sudden, as you start listening to Swamiji, he says, because what I'm saying to you is, as Swami indicated here, to expand a positive way of looking at your concept of self. That's why you do it. Because you're beginning to find out that in the other person lies the same innate essence of spirit that is you. We call it Brahman. And that's why Swamiji says, as soon as you can, get up and be doing after you whatever morning shrine, and go out in the streets. If you want to find God, I'll tell you where you can find him very quickly and nearly in another human being. One that needs, even at the simplest level of food, they're the essential things. He said it's an insult to preach religion to a man on a hungry stomach. Oof. Why unselfish? Because I want you to break that bond of thinking of the ego as being yourself. Your brain locked up in a bony cranium, misplaced concreteness, fallacy of simple location, whitehead, all these things. Hey, I want you to realize that you, the amness of I am, is in the other person that's waiting for you to come and remedialize her in his situation. That's why Swamiji says it, to have a grander view. And it's not an if and or but thing. He says, you know, start with your family and then go to the city, the county, the state, the country, the world. And Jesus really is radical. Jesus really is rad. He says, from the perspective of Advaita Vedanta, of the knowledge of his oneness with Brahman, I and my Father are one, that you cannot stop until you have loved every person, that is to say, in your attitude and orientation in the world, including your enemy. And he said, you know, you've heard it said that you should love your family and your friends and hate your enemy. I say you should love your enemy. He said, as far as loving your family and friends, even the Gentiles do that. And for some reason, it's worth thinking about, Jesus had again this penchant about the Gentiles. He told his disciples who expected his return during their lifetimes in Israel. Some of the greatest phrases he ever mentioned are, I just love the idea of reading between the bookends, the birth and death of Jesus, his life. I like to say he lived to save us all. So he said things that were just remarkable. He wanted his disciples to expand the message of mysticism, of union with God, beyond the realms of Israel. And he said one of the great phrases in the Bible, the field is the world. That's what Swami Vivekananda is saying. And then he said that he wanted his disciples to go and shine the light their light on the Gentiles.
Yeah, I was mentioning at the breakfast table the other day over peanut butter
Ah.
that George Washington Carver was very saintly, and it's this unselfishness that made him that way. His whole life
Really?
was geared towards how can I help people?
Really?
You know, what can I do with these plants that will help people?
Thousands of things
Yeah.
that they get out of peanut.
And you know, there was sort of maybe 30, 34 years ago or so, there started to be a bigger emphasis on how to be successful in business. And many of these motivational speakers would emphasize that you have to think of your customers first. That's what's going to make you successful. Don't put your mind on how can I make more money? How can I squeeze another penny of profit somewhere? But how can I serve the customers? And that's what's going to make your company profitable. My sister had a friend that sold linens in a department store. I mean, this is how commonplace can you get? This is a very simple example. But she approached it as, here's a customer and he or she must have some need. And I need to know what the need is. And then I will help them find what will help fill their need. And she was very successful, and she just loved her work. Absolutely loved her work.
Well, Swami, you're on a roll. This is really something. There is something to the business dynamic. And those of us who may have had the opportunity of running across a really great person like Dale Carnegie, who is Swami Yutishanan, I guess, mentions it.
Could
He
be.
writes in there.
Somebody did. I thought.
And so forth. A business ethic, but it's deeper than that. A business dynamic, a sales dynamic, exactly what the Swami is speaking about. And it's ironic, though these people have existed, and I mean, it's quite interesting. A fellow named Napoleon Hill and all this sort of approach to life, which is spiritual. Now it looks as if some other day we might find ourselves in that field, as if the great template, we talked about it maybe, the oval plates that India, in its cyclical history, theory of history, they've been around so many times, you're like a record around around the sun on the planet. So the king, the society was placed in the hands of the men and women of God to begin with, we'll say. And then the rulers became the kings because the men and women of God became egotistical. And so the kings come along and give us avatars, all of them, Buddha, all of them. And then they too become too limited. So the cycle that we've lived in, our lives currently, is the business template. It's brought us the railroad, it's brought us liberty under law, it's brought us all these great things. So much so that Stephen Vincent Benet, a wonderful northern poet, in a tone poem called John Brown's Body, called Our Civil War, which is an analogy of a sort to the Bhagavad Gita. So much so that I mentioned it once in Washington, D.C., Swami, on Memorial Day in church. And bear with me now, the thing that I'm trying to reach for here is that the business culture, oh yes, Stephen Vincent Benet called the Civil War the rebellion of the earth against the age of steam. So here it comes. The Civil War was the birth of the modern industrial business age, this railroad and so forth. And what a run it's been. And particularly when you get these near saintly people understanding truly that to love your customer is really to love the very essence of your own being, extended and enlarged. I know one man that, I don't know, he had something about him, he had something he wanted to do, he put it on his list. He was going to sell this guy something before midnight. So it ended up, the salesman sold his own piano in order to be able to buy, if you will, this new sister, this new brother, something to extend the furniture, if you will, of the original person, the interior decorating, as John Dobson used to kind of exterior decorate, such that his soul and his love and his awareness is grander. Okay, and now you see, my friends, I want you to consider it. It looks as if, I suggest, because Swami Vivekananda indicated that around the lake in Kashmir with, I think, Tanteen, and maybe, all these, Sister Christine, all these people, that the next template is coming. And I suggest you might want to try it on for size and see if it fits. Just at the time that some of these business people are getting the true message of what love really means. And it looks like the next great arc, great oval thing, in which the sovereignty of the people is about to occur. And into their hands will be given the reins of government. As Jesus said, the meek shall inherit the earth. And because the business culture has now become a rotten egg. It's done everything it could. And now greed, one of the two great idols of American life. Everybody criticizes the East for what they think of as idol worship when they know perfectly well what they're doing. There's one infinity shining that the Indian people are worshiping in their various ways. So the new age coming is going to give into the hands of those that Jesus spoke of and said, the meek shall inherit the earth. Well, the question is, what kind of earth they're going to inherit? And now environmental sustainability, which is far more serious than the COVID virus. Far more serious, because it's endemic. Without people, you're not going to have anybody to talk to. You're not going to have anybody to achieve the meaning of the birth into life that Abhedananda ends his book with, which is to love God, to see, to worship God, to invite the divine presence within oneself as love and light, which of course is bhakti and jnana. Abhedananda says so clearly, jnana is light. So this is really fascinating. Just about the time they seem to be catching on, it looks like we're about to enter the new age. And it can't come too soon for me. It's a kind of an Abe Lincoln relegate here or something. I look forward to this day, as have so many of us. Carl Sandburg said it so beautifully in one of his great poems. He's the emotional, the Beethoven of the Lincoln biographers, Carl Sandburg. And his poem was The People. Yes. All right, Swami, I don't want to read.
I'm going to read the previous sentence a little bit.
Good.
As long as we think of ourselves as separate from one another and as not related to the universe, so long shall we follow the dictates of our limited and imperfect will and think that by doing so we shall gain the highest benefit. The result is that we make mistakes at every step, and these mistakes cause us to feel dissatisfied, unhappy, and sorrowful. We do not gain what we wanted, nor do we reach the goal for which we started. The idea of separateness or mistaken notion makes the apparent life or ego think that it is free and independent, while in fact it is bound hand and foot like a slave. The moment we realize our relation to the whole, we are no longer bound by any conditions of selfishness, but we are free. At present, we are living as slaves without being conscious of our slavery. By mistake, we are imagining that we are free. But if we think our life most minutely, we shall find that we are not free. If we look around us, it would be almost impossible to find a man or a woman whom we could call truly free. We ought to be ashamed of this state of things, but we are not, because we do not know that we are in bondage. Very few indeed realize that this life is a life of slavery and drudgery, and that the ego is enchained by the conditions of the phenomenal world. Amongst those who realize this, A few struggle for emancipation, and very few of these become really free. But the majority delude themselves by thinking that they are free, and so love the present condition of their unblessed life, and do not seek a better state. There, there have been cases where a man born and brought up as a slave and living in a society of slaves has preferred to remain a slave rather than become a free citizen. Think of some of the black people of South Carolina who actually preferred slavery to freedom. If anyone gets some idea of freedom and tries to get out of slavery, his fellow slaves will think that he is going the wrong way and will try to force him to continue the old life and strive by all means to hinder his becoming a free citizen. But a courageous man who loves freedom and struggles day and night for emancipation will not be dominated by the influence of others. He will seek the company of those who are also striving to be free and have wiped off the mark of slavery from their foreheads to learn from them the means of attaining freedom.
I love the spiritual because it's a watchword.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Before I'd be a slave, I'd be moldering in my grave. Go home to my Lord and be free. I don't care where you bury my body. I don't care where you bury my body. I don't care where you bury my body. My soul's gonna live with God. And then he arose, he arose, he arose, he arose, he arose from the dead. He arose, he arose, he arose, he arose, he arose from the dead. He arose, he arose, he arose, he arose, he arose from the dead. And the Lord will bear my spirit home. The whole problem in the United States today, why we are moving forward and must do so, as that we do not understand the meaning of the inalienable rights God-given of God and nature's God, Thomas Jefferson. The inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And seeking in the phenomenal world, the world of the seeming appearance of the outside world, and assuming that to be real when it's an appearance, leads to seeking life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in all the wrong places. So here comes India. Here comes the cavalry at the 11th hour, as far as at least the business culture is concerned, to show us the cascading waterfall of the superconscious realm, which we don't know about. It's a matter of common understanding. We know about the three states, waking, dreaming, sleep. That's what our psychologists have to some extent concerned themselves with. But what is on the way with India arriving now, the great crashing up of mysticism upon the spirit, upon the rocks of the analytical Aristotelian Greek culture, is India's awareness that there is a realm of the superconsciousness which brings us the worldview Swami is trying to have us understand and see of what I love to call God country. Where are we, Swami? Where are we here?
We finally made it through the paragraph.
Did we?
Down there.
All right, let's just see. The community in which we are now living is exactly like that of the slaves. Being deluded by our, but believe me, there weren't that many. Yes, quite a few for all kinds of reasons, logistic and otherwise, and sometimes affection. stayed on the old plantation, now as free men and women. Don't get me started. Don't get me started. The United States, and I mean all of us, have a lot of agricultural work to do. A lot of hoeing and digging and planting and going around 180 degrees and standing in the shoes of the man or woman who's looking right back at you. And I don't care what your family looks like when you're born. It's the same thing. And seeing the perspective from the other person's point of view, as Swamiji wants us to do, and look back in those eyes looking at us, or looking at us and seeing from it. We've got to do it. There's no other way. So let us welcome the day that's a dawning, in which we hold out our hands to our brother and sister and say, brother, I love you. Not just you, as Tom Jones or Liza Smith. It's not quite like that. I love what is deep down within you, deeper than anyone can see, but you can feel, consciously, subconsciously, dimly aware of what the Swami in Australia calls my amness. And I love that in you, and I esteem that in you, and I reverence it. Not just admire, I reverence it. And I say with my Swami Vivekananda, what can I do for you? There will be a response. Swami, why don't you pick up if you can find it?
On the contrary, we fault with those who criticize them, call them crazy or foolish, and essay to put them behind the doors of the lunatic asylum, and such is our mental condition. We are not slaves to our desires, passions, senses, and also to the body. Are we not slaves to our desires, passions, senses, and also to the body, and the changes that are constantly going on in the machinery of the human organism?
Did you actually use that phrase? Probably you didn't. I wasn't with it. Being deluded, first sentence, by our vanity and self-conceit, we do not realize our present condition, never struggle for freedom.
I think I said
that's just the beginning. Yeah.
All right.
I couldn't get off the first sentence. Go on.
Are we not slaves of anger, hatred, jealousy, fear, and sense enjoyments? Are we not slaves of greed, wealth, and possessions? Are we not slaves to our ordinary desires for political power and also for name and fame? Are we not constantly obeying the commands of these masters who are ruling within us? Where is our freedom? Really, we are slaves to desires, passions, comfort, luxury, ambition, pride, beauty, anger, hatred, and sense pleasures, but we do not feel bondage in them or are not conscious of the fetters. How elated and flattered we feel when any person utters sweet and kind words. How insulted, wounded, and hurt we feel when we hear harsh and unkind words, and how we long for revenge when we are injured. Can there be any condition worse than this? Are we born to follow this course and obey these pitiless masters all our lives? We rarely ask such questions. On the other hand, we say that this life is full of happiness and pleasure, while we have a longing for sense pleasures. We suffer and are unhappy. We are sleeping the sleep of ignorance after drinking, as it were, the cup of fearfully intoxicating liquor of self-delusion.
Wow, now there's another one of his zingers. Swami, would you be willing to read that last one, which I think lights up like slowly? I want to hear it again. Wow, huh?
We are sleeping the
Oh,
sleep
that's it.
of ignorance after drinking, as it were, the cup of the fearfully intoxicating liquor of self-delusion.
There you go.
All humanity is madly pursuing the phantoms of hope, which change their colors as one approaches them, or suddenly vanish to reappear at a distance with fresh brightness like will-o'-the-wisps, forcing the pursuer to chase them again. The vain pursuit of these phantoms of hope leads humanity into unbearable suffering, misery, and disappointment. We have made ourselves slaves of these deluding phantoms, and this is the way in which we are living. Each individual loves something and strives after something, but knows not what it is or how to get it. Do you know what we are striving after? We are striving after happiness, but we do not know the condition through which that happiness comes. It will never come under the conditions in which we are now living. Happiness does not come to a slave. He may delude for the time being and may think that he is happy, but when he comes to his senses and asks himself, "Am I happy now?" he finds that after all it is not happiness, but it is a delusion or Maya. Happiness does not exist in slavery but in freedom. He who is free is alone truly happy. This happiness which comes through perfect freedom is eternal. If we want that unending and eternal happiness, we shall have to become free by breaking down the chain of slavery.
Swami, I think at the moment we need to just return
Sure.
to home plate for a
It's
minute.
another paragraph that's
Well, is it? But
fairly lengthy.
But the thing is, returning to home plate for a minute, let's remind ourselves that the way to find this source, that God is the source of happiness. Source of happy is God. Source of unhappy is appearance. God's the reality. And the way that we have been, I don't know, what a blessed extension of the Indian spirit to come to us, given to understand the way to find this realm of the real is in, let us say, meditation. Raja Yoga, the royal path, is like a handle for each of the other three, love, knowledge, and work, which are all blended. I love when Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese mystic poet, says work is love made visible. Aye. But the point is that the way to find this cascading fountain and waterfall of superconscious of God is in meditation. That is to say, is within, because it's the handle for all the other yogas, the royal yoga. That is to say, whatever one's path is, it's an inward path, and it has to do with where one places one's mind. And we mentioned it last week, and I think it's a good thing to mention it again, that in Vedanta, which is the word that was selected by our superluminaries of the modern days, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and so forth, to represent the new effulgence, rather than the old word of a very big religious river, Vedanta is precisely because it depends where we put our mind, and we are all Advaitists. There are kind of like three different delightful melodies, like you hear the ice cream man go by with the car. One is the Pujarinis at noon. You think it come in from the outside, I think it's silent worship. Well, it is silent worship to the outside. The Pujarini is going through the most delicate and intense, delightful presentation of ideas, where to place the mind, for the express purpose of finding union with God. The second way has to do with the delightful life and expression of, say, Krishna, of whom it was said, as they said of David, and David danced with abandon before the Lord. Krishna is supposed in the Bhagavad Gita to have milked the cow of the Vedas. The Vedas are the laboratory reports of the illumined souls who somehow discovered meditation in the land of India, what I call the Avatar Belt, near the equator. And you see prototypical Mohenjo-daro, the Indus Valley civilization, pictures of a proto-Shiva sitting there, Rudra, in the meditative pose. So they discovered it. And that is why the last portion, Swami, as we've heard you and I, of the Vedas, that is to say the Upanishads, the wisdom portion, the end portion, literally thus Veda, Anta, end, Anta, Veda, Video, I see, the insights. And it was Krishna then that made this wonderful super conscious awareness in meditation available to the world through his milking the cow of the Bhagavad Gita. And then there are those luminaries who pass through our lives, such as Vivekananda himself, a great lover of humanity and a weeper of the sorrow, saying, I want a religion that can feed the orphan and dry the widow's tear. And even went as far as saying, anything else to me is not religion. And he comes through our midst as he came through the house that we stayed in South Pasadena in 1900 for 6 weeks, which is now a shrine, the shrine for the Vedanta Society of America, one of the great ones. He said, and you can feel it, he just passed through the room. A few years back, when I went there, it was 1955, so he was there in 1900, you figure. And he said, it's all inside. It's all where you put your mind. And he was saying, you know, I'm going to tell you a secret. And somehow it's almost as if he says that the first day or two that you come to Vedanta. It was Ramakrishna. This place is so marvelously subtle and yet like a Beethoven symphony, so full of everything. And so Ramakrishna says, first jnana and then bhakti. Meaning that, yeah, you can get it in the first 24, 48 hours. One shining infinity, yes or no? How do you feel? If that, then God is everything, there's nothing else. Vivekananda says, hey, the path of the jnani is to discriminate between the apparent and the real every moment of his or her life. So there are different paths, every one of which in Vedanta leads to Advaita. Advaita, atypical. That A in Greek means non, dual, non-dualism. The positive word would be monism. And there are among us, some of us would say rare examples, of those who are willing to try to follow Vivekananda wherever he leads. Kind of like running down the street, trying to follow. And keep their minds steady on the difference between the apparent, which fills 9/10 of most people's life. It should be the other way around. And the real, which should be 9/10 at least. So there are the 4 yoga people, as we phrase it. The Gyanis will put it a little differently, but the point is where you put your mind, and it's all working towards Advaita. All right, Swami, we're coming down the main street. Where are you? I might tune in.
Yeah, you had your song. You know,
Good for you.
reminded
Let's
me
have
of
a whole
the
1
song,
hour.
although I'm not sure
You probably wrote it.
I can't remember how many as many verses as you could remember. But there was that Christian Science hymn that we'd sing in the choir every once in a while. Only God can give us gladness. Only God can give us peace. so forth and so on.
Please give us a
But
couple more
well,
lines.
no, I'm
it's
not
so
sure I
good.
can remember.
Oh,
the
it's
words.
beautiful.
But anyway, yeah,
And
so
can you
it's a
imagine
nice
different
thing.
voices? Oh,
All right.
that's the beauty of Vedanta, different voices. It is. Mm-hmm.
That happiness which comes through perfect freedom is eternal. If we want that unending and eternal happiness, we shall have to become free by breaking down the chain of slavery. We should remember that if we were really free, we would have been happy, and we should not need to seek happiness, because freedom is the condition of permanent and unchangeable happiness. Again, before seeking freedom, we must realize the unblessed state of our earthly life and must become conscious of the fact that this apparent life is a slave life.
Well, now that's quite an almost good stopping point, but we're not quite there yet. I wonder, what is about to break forth upon the world? It just so happens, isn't this interesting, that the accompaniments of the meek, which are now entering into the places of government around the world according to this diagram, the halls of self-government, one grand accompaniment of the grand populations which are emerging, African American, Latino, to start with two, are men and women of grand spirituality. This is a very interesting thing, that as we are moving inexorably into the new world of the sovereignty of the Spirit, India's come to our rescue, and we have in this country preachers all over the place, somehow deeply saturated. I'm talking about African American preachers to start with. Deeply saturated like a donut in coffee, and the sugar thereof, of the sweetness of religion seen as experience. And to me, my friends, that is spirituality. And to woo, if you meet a Latino person, particularly in the southwest of the United States, this land is your land, this land is my land. From California now to the New York Island, my friends are taking back every square inch that was taken from them by conquest. That's the law of history. The conqueror always sinks into the landscape because there are fewer of them than there are the conquered. Simple as that. Here come the Norman French, all these people we love, Richard Lionheart. Hey, they ain't no lion. Here, Richard, Coeur de Lion, he spoke French. He was not exactly a Frenchman, but he spoke French. Because his ancestors, his people, they came down Vikings from Norway. The French had a wonderful thing in the Ile-de-France where Paris is, carved in stone. Oh Lord, from the fury of the Northmen, deliver us. So here they come down, 800, led by a fellow so fat he couldn't ride a horse. Rollo the Ganger, the walker, had a walk. Vikings to the core, and the king gave them the part of France that sticks out called Normandy to this day. And it was a successful move. And then in 1066, they go trotting over to England, by now duly baptized, more churches in Rouen than any place else that you could find. Hey! They are fewer in number than the Anglo-Saxons whom they have conquered. So Richard is speaking French, John is speaking French, they're all speaking French until Edward, the first, second, or third comes along. Yeah, it took a while. And guess what? He's talking English. So it's the law that the conquered can't even leave the railroad tracks. In the case of the Japanese and in China before World War II, huh? Because it was sinking in the landscape. And it's that part of the Mexican people, Mexicanos. It's not even the Spanish part of them, dear hearts. It's the indigenous part of them that is taking back. That means adding to the flavor and the sauce, and yes, the spirituality of this country as we go now into the new day, which is exactly what we're going through right now. And how many people can see it? That's what's going on in America today. And as the new people come in, a new constituency, a new brotherhood and sisterhood, whether it's African American, or Latino, whether it's South Korean, whether it's Native American, whether it's South Asian, they all have tremendous components of people walking with them, like Rolla the Ganger, who are men and women of God. In Latino families, you find them right in a family. Same thing, and also, but preachers, we have aplenty in this country. I'm talking about spiritual. I'm talking about you go to anybody who has not yet been to an African American church should, with great humility, ask within his heart if he's welcome. And you find out he's welcome. A person should do that just as soon as she and he can. And one should hold out the hand to Latino, whom hopefully is escaping. We can't take the whole world on board, that's right. But the ones that we've got, we've helped escape, and the church would be glad to know it, from cruel poverty and a life which is scarcely worth living. Talk about sleep. As India has come to the West, Abhedananda said Buddha had a message for the East. I have a message for the West. Well, God love us all, both great and small.
Probably time to sign off.
Sign in.
Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Peace, peace, peace.